Welcome to the stage Mary Gallagher, Marilyn Keough Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the first Notre Dame keynote event of the 2025-2026 academic year. This afternoon's conversation is titled Hope, Global Stability, and the Role of the United States. It will feature special guest General Martin Dempsey and Notre Dame's president, Reverend Robert A. Dowd, C.S.C. As a university, we have a responsibility to foster a learning environment that facilitates respectful discussions and constructive engagement, perhaps especially around challenging issues and topics where we disagree. And one of the ways we do that is through this Notre Dame Forum. Established in 2005, the Notre Dame Forum is an annual series that invites campus-wide reflections and dialogue about issues of importance to the university, the nation, and the world. And this year, Father Bob has chosen the theme, Cultivating Hope. I first heard Father Bob speak about cultivating hope at the end of last semester. The Keough School had just faced tremendous difficulties with federal funding, as grants from our USAID and the Department of State were paused and then canceled. Our work addressing poverty, gang violence, and implementation of peace accords was deeply impacted. And though we're working today to maintain our work and find new ways to address the pressing problems of poverty, war, and marginalization, at that retreat, Father Bob made an important distinction between optimism and hope. Cultivating hope is even more important when it's hard to be optimistic. As the United States and the world, we face many complex and interconnected challenges. Cultivating hope that a better future is possible, if not immediately probable, is essential. And it's critical to do the work we do as educators, as researchers, and as bridge builders. So, given these realities, what opportunities exist to create a more just and peaceful world? How can each of us play a role in cultivating hope? Our collective task today is to think about these questions. Before I welcome our speakers to the stage, I'd like to invite you all to submit any questions that you may have during the discussion via the QR code on the screen. Father Dowd and General Dempsey will address as many questions as they can during this time of Q&A following the discussion. So now, without further delay, let's welcome to the stage the 18th President of Notre Dame, Reverend Bob Dowd, and General Martin Dempsey. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dean Gallagher, and welcome, everybody. It's great to be together here today, and a very special welcome to General Martin Dempsey. General Dempsey, as many of you know, served as the 37th Chief of Staff of the Army and the 18th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior military leader in the United States. And he served in that role between 2011 and 2015. General Dempsey is a 1974 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And General Dempsey was a career Army officer whose assignments have taken him around the world. Before becoming the Army's Chief of Staff, he served as Deputy Commander and then Acting Commander of U.S. Central Command, and he led the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. A decorated soldier, General Dempsey's many, many awards and decorations include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and many, many more. We would be here all afternoon if I listed all of his decorations and honors. I'm happy to say, very happy to say, that General Dempsey has been a friend, a great friend of Notre Dame for many years now. And in fact, in 2016, he received an honorary degree from the university and was our principal commencement speaker. And we've got a slide right here to show you. There's my predecessor, Father John, along with Dick Noterbart, who was our chair at the time, and General Dempsey. So it's great to have you back at your alma mater.
Thank you, Father.
Yeah, we count you as a graduate. Following 41 years of military service, General Dempsey now teaches leadership at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business and consults for the National Basketball Association and serves as chair of the USA Basketball. And beyond these many, many accolades and accomplishments, General Dempsey is a man of character, a true servant leader, and he values family greatly. He is the grandson of 4 Irish immigrants, a member of the Irish American Hall of Fame, and is joined here today by his high school sweetheart, Deanie, his wife for 49 years. Let's give a hand to Deanie. So General Dempsey, we are delighted to have you back at Notre Dame. Thanks for taking the time to be with us for this conversation about hope and cultivating hope at this time in our country and in our world. I'm going to call an audible with the first question. I hope you don't mind. I know you visited Father John's class this afternoon, and I'd like to hear, how did it go? How did it go?
It went great. No, honestly, Denny and I on the way between Bond Hall and here talked a lot about the young men and women in the classroom. I mean, we're big fans of Father John and you, Father Bob, your whole faculty, but it's the young men and women who really set this place apart. And some of you are, have been young men and women before. I'll just leave that hanging for a moment. But what I really mean by that is you should be very proud about this university, about what it stands for. Things like the theme here, cultivating hope. What a perfect theme in a year where I think too few people are actually trying to cultivate hope. So, thanks for that. Thanks for inviting us. We're proud to be here.
Thank you, General. Thank you. So cultivating hope. You've had a long and accomplished military career, that's for sure, serving our country. And can you just share a few thoughts here to begin with about, what has given you hope over the years? What does hope mean to you, based on your experience and service in the U.S. military?
Yeah. When I first was invited and the theme was cultivating hope, I thought, wow, I hope people don't, you could come to the conclusion that a military leader is probably an odd selection to talk about hope, because generally our services are required when really hope is lost, right? But what I find to be powerful about this is about the role of hope in leadership. And I think, in fact, I'm quite confident in saying that there is a very definite relationship between hope and trust. And in the military, and I think in most walks of life, actually, the success of leadership is in building trust among those entrusted to our care. So in the military, we ask those young men and women to do some pretty incredible things. They will only do them if they have trust in the leaders who are giving the instructions and the policies that they're asked to uphold, and trust with their fellow citizens that their service will be valued. And so, hope and trust in terms of leadership are inseparable. And so I've made quite an effort through the years to learn more about exactly how to cultivate hope in the interest of building trust, so that young men and women have confidence to do the things we ask them to do.
Excellent. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hope and trust.
Yeah.
That they go together.
Can I add one more thing? Because we're in a whole room full of either people who are Irish or who want to be Irish. Right? I mean, isn't that the way this works? There's a great quote by William Butler Yeats. Some of you know Yeats, probably the most famous Irish poet ever, and was at his most famous in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And he was a man who fell in love with a woman named Maud Gunn. And Maud Gunn really didn't really want any part of him. I mean, they were friendly, but she didn't really want to be as friendly as he wanted to be. And he proposed to her once, and she turned him down. And he proposed a second time, and she turned him down. He proposed a third time, but this time he figured out that he was a poet. And so he wrote her a poem. And in that poem were these words: "Tread carefully, for I lay my dreams beneath your feet. Tread carefully, or you risk treading on my dreams." And you might wonder, why in the heck did you bring that up, General? I'll tell you why I bring it up. It has occurred to me over time that leaders, that's actually a poem. It is about love. And by the way, she turned him down a third time too.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
but is it not a leader's responsibility to be aware of the fact that everyone that they're entrusted to lead has their own hopes, dreams, fears, and the leader is treading on those. And so tread carefully. Think about the people you're leading and what they need, as you go forward. So I just kind of connect that to the. I always find a way to weave Yeats into everything.
We chose the theme "Cultivating Hope" with a little help from Pope Francis, who before he passed away, declared this Jubilee year in the Catholic community, to declare the theme of this Jubilee year to be Pilgrims of Hope. So we selected "Cultivating Hope." But it's important for us here at Notre Dame to remember that Christian hope is something that is kind of grounded on a promise, and that there's a spiritual dimension to hope. It's something deep and abiding. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a personal story from your career, maybe a moment of grace in a moment of darkness, or a moment when maybe it seemed like a hopeless moment, but somehow there was grace at work. Is there something like that you might share with us?
Well, the moment of grace has to be when she didn't turn me down the first time, because I would have really been a miserable poet, by the way. I do have one story, and it goes back to when I was a second lieutenant in January, I think. Well, it was probably more like September of 75. I was a brand new second lieutenant, 22 years old, figured I knew everything there was to know about, the Army and about leadership. Not really. I mean, I was pretty humble about the whole thing. But remember now, our military was a conscript army until 73. And then it took a while to transition fully to all volunteers. The reason I bring that up is I had 40 men. It was all men in those days. I had 40 men in a little border camp. Our job was to patrol the border between Czechoslovakia, which was part of the Soviet bloc, and West Germany, which was part of NATO. And our job was to patrol about 100 kilometers or so of border. And we did it in Jeeps with, no tops and a compass. I tell this story to kids today, and they say, well, what about, didn't you have like Waze you could find your way around? But in any case, when I turned up to lead this platoon, about half of them were conscripts. They'd been drafted, and about half of them were volunteers. And look, conscript soldiers were great soldiers, but by nature, they didn't volunteer. And so there was always a percentage that just didn't want to be there, marking time till they could go home. A lot of them, tended to get in trouble in those days with, there was race. Race was a huge issue in the early 70s. Drugs that came in, through the Asia pipeline, through Turkey into Germany, and our soldiers would often find a way to get themselves in hot water with that. So in a platoon of about 40, there was always 5, 6, 7 who had gotten themselves in some kind of trouble and were probably, being administratively processed out. Now, you'll see why I tell that story, because I had this border camp. It was a chain link fence, about the size of a football field, maybe, and Quonset huts where we lived, and we had a headquarters and a motor pool, and we did our jobs, and there was always a patrol out, pretty much 24/7. A patrol would be 2 Jeeps, not Jeeps, like the kind you see in the movies, no tops, your radios, and this compass that I tell you about. And it was high adventure when you send a patrol out because, you know, again, the border wasn't well marked. And the one sure way to lose your job as a second lieutenant was to have one of your patrols wander into Czechoslovakia. So it was pretty high adventure. One day I'm in the command center monitoring the patrol not by watching on GPS, but rather by them calling in and telling me they're at checkpoint 1, they're at checkpoint 2, they're at checkpoint 3. So I got an idea of where they are. And the gate guard, there's a guy that was guarding the gate, comes running into the command center. He says, "Sir, I need you to come with me." I said, "Well, look, I can't come right now. I'm monitoring this patrol." He said, "No, you have to come to the gate, sir." I said, "Why?" And by the way, it was one of those 5 or 6 or 7 that I told you about that was probably waiting discharge for drugs or something. So he says, "You got to come to the gate." I said, "Why do I have to come to the gate?" He said, "There's a nun at the gate." Mind you, the border camp was in the middle of a forest off of a fire trail about 3 kilometers from the border. At 5 kilometers, no one was allowed in. There was a 5K zone. He said, "You got to come to the gate. There's a nun." And I thought, wow, I really do have a drug problem. He persisted. I went out. As I'm walking up to the gate, guess what's standing on the other side of the gate? A nun. And there was nothing around for 5, 6, 7 kilometers. So I walked up and thinking I should use my fledgling German, I asked her who she was and why she was there. And in perfect English, not really perfect because it turns out she was from Milwaukee, but in English she said, "My name is Sister Mary Cecilia. I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm over here on a visit to help promote the cause of Teresa Neumann." You ever heard of that name? Teresa Neumann was a woman in the 50s and 60s who had stigmata, and they were trying to get her canonized. By the way, they're close. I think she's beatified now. But anyway, she's at this convent in Connersreuth, Germany, and she'd heard we were there, and she wandered over. I don't know how she got there. And she's at my gate, and I said, "Well, what can I do for you, sister?" And she said, "I want to come in and pray with your soldiers." And I said to myself, I don't remember anything in the book about dealing with nuns at the gate in a German book.
That wasn't in the manual.
Yeah. And so I did what any self-respecting Catholic would do, and I lied to her. I said, "Sister, I have an exercise going on. I can't bring you in now." But I said, "Look, if you were to come back next week, I might be able to do something." I said, "I'd really appreciate, I thank you for offering to pray with our soldiers." And she said, "Okay, well, I'll leave now." I said, "Well, can I get you a ride someplace? Can I have someone drive you?" She said, "No, I'll go back the way I came." And turns around. And by the way, she's in all the gear. I mean, the usual black shoes with the heel and the habit and I don't know what the names of this stuff is, but I went to Catholic school and she was the real deal. So off she goes. And she was about, 5'2" maybe? And, anyway, off she went. So I went back into the headquarters and I said to my intel officer, I said, "Do me a favor, call up the higher headquarters and ask them if there's been any sightings of a nun in the." And then I thought to myself, no, wait, don't do that. If you ask that question, I'm going, they're going to think I've lost my mind. I said, just casually call around and find out if anybody's seeing a nun wandering around in our forest. And he came back and said, no, nobody's seen any nuns in this neighborhood. So anyway, the week passes. The next week it rained. And then the next week I'd forgotten all about it. In comes the gate guard. "Sir, the nun's back." I said, I said words that Catholic boys shouldn't say about nuns. But anyway, I walked out to the gate and I said, "Okay, sister," I said, "here's the deal. I'll let you in, but you got to stay with me the whole time. Don't wander off by yourself." Okay, Lieutenant, I'll do that. Open up, in she comes. I should have mentioned that on the way to the gate, I walked past, we had a makeshift basketball court. And on the basketball court were 6 of the 7 bad guys that I told you about. Not bad guys, bad soldiers. They were just marking time, wait till they were discharged, and they were out there playing basketball. And then I walked by them, took note of it. Anyway, I opened the gate. The nun makes a beeline. I had no intention of bringing her to them. She makes a beeline to these 6 guys. She walks right into the middle of their game, and they're mad. And they look at me like, "What? Really? You got a nun in the middle of my basketball game?" And I said, "Men, Sister Mary Cecilia, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is here. She'd like to pray with you. And as we do in the military, I said, this is an opportunity. Nobody's going to make you pray with her, but you have this opportunity, and I think you'd be well served to take it. So I turned around and walked back to the edge of the basketball court, thinking they would usher her off. And I turned around, and all 6 of them are like this, and they're praying. Honestly, the darndest thing not that I'd ever seen, but that was right up near the top. She finishes making her rounds. She gets back to the gate, and she says, you offered to give me a ride last week. I didn't take it, but I would like a ride today. I said, okay. I said, I'll get a driver and a Jeep. She said, no. This is how I knew she really was a nut. She said, no, you're going to drive. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the real deal. She is a nun. I've had this conversation before. So I said, okay. I didn't have a license, by the way. I'd only been in country for a few weeks. I didn't have a Jeep license. So I'm thinking, oh, this would be great. First I get a nun in here. Now I'm going to crash the Jeep and then no license. I'm going down. But I drove her. But I got her in the seat, passenger seat. I'm in the driver's seat, stick shift, which I hadn't driven in a long time. I'm driving down the fire trail, and all of her stuff is flapping in the wind. Mm-hmm. No top on the Jeep, and it's slapping me and slapping me. And I said, sister, could you hold down your habit a little bit before we have an accident? Anyway, and she's laughing and giggling, and we get to her convent, and this is where your question absolutely hit home. So she gets out and she says, can I come back next week? I said, sure, sister, you're welcome. And she starts to walk away and she stops. You ever see the detective show Columbo, where he always starts walking away and then he turns around and says, by the way, and then he gets the guy convicted? She's walking away and she turns around and she said, hey, by the way, why didn't you want me to meet those soldiers on the basketball court? And I said, well, sister, to be honest with you, they're not my best soldiers. She said, yeah, but they're your soldiers, right? I said, yeah, what? They're all my soldiers. She said, well, you haven't given up on them, have you? And I thought, you son of a gun, you just stabbed me in the heart. And you just taught me a lesson. I graduated from West Point after 47 months, and I learned more that day from that nun about leadership than I'd learned in my entire career. What she was saying was, look, don't give up on people. Some of them will give up on you, but don't you give up on them. Make them feel a sense of belonging, and who knows what will happen. So I said, phew. Got back in the Jeep, drove back to the thing. They're still playing basketball. I walked over, took off my uniform jacket, and went out and played basketball with those guys.
Wow.
I'm almost emotional about it.
Yeah.
Not almost. 20 years later. So anyway, I'll give you the punchline. I saved about 3 of them. Not saved. I mean, I allowed them to save themselves by making them feel important again. The other 3 were too far gone. 20 years later, I'm giving up command of a regiment at Fort Carson, Colorado. 20 years later. And we have a receiving line to people thank you for, they come by and they thank you, and before you go to your next job. And this big tall guy standing there, and I looked at his name tag, and he's a master sergeant, which is the second highest enlisted rank. And he said, you remember me? And I said, mm-hmm. He was one of them.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was great.
Amazing.
Sorry.
That's a beautiful story.
So, I mean, look, I not to stomp my foot too hard, but if you cultivate hope, people will respond. They just will.
Yeah, that is a great story,
Yeah.
and there's a great lesson there. That's clearly a moment of grace. So thank you for sharing that. Now, you in your last job, you had an amazing responsibility for advising the president and the National Security Council when it comes to the risks in our world and how the United States should engage in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were advising our senior elected officials today, how would you describe the state of global security?
I think the first thing I would say is that in my judgment, which is all I can bring to bear on these problems, the importance of the United States engagement globally is far more important than it was even when I was chairman. look, what we've got is, if you think about the three big powers, especially the three big nuclear powers, US, Russia, China, each of us have a different approach to national security. Ours is through allies and partners. We generally ensure our security with 55 like-minded nations. The Chinese, well, let me talk about the Russians first. The Russians, in particular under President Putin, are really about revanchism, if that phrase is familiar to you. They're trying to recreate their sphere of influence. You know, they're trying to surround Mother Russia with friendly neighbors with whom they can then trade, make themselves less vulnerable to, you know, to things like economic sanctions and things. So it's really about expanding their influence. And China, you know, my impression of what China's doing, and you know, after years of study, is it's really about their supply chain. I mean, China's got 1.4 billion people. That's a heck of a lift for any leader or any government. And so they've got to deliver on their economy. They got to deliver on resources. And so when you see what they do in Africa and South America, the South China Sea, it's about a supply chain. So here's the issue. When their supply chain rubs up against our allies and partners, potential conflict. When Russia's revanchism rubs up against our NATO allies, potential conflict. But you have to see the terms, you have to see it in those terms. It's not about ideologies, really. It's about the pragmatics of how each of the three countries, you know, deal with their national security. Then you have a couple of middleweight powers, Iran and North Korea. They're kind of, people call them rogue nations. I don't know if rogue does it justice there. You know, they feel themselves to have been cheated out of the rest of the world, and they're angry about it, and some of them have nuclear weapons, and then there's, you know, when you crank religion into the mix, in the case of Iran, the Shia sect of Islam, it can be very volatile. And then there's transnational terrorist organizations. Used to be Al-Qaeda, then it became ISIS. You know, now there's any number of different acronyms to describe it, but terrorism is still out there. And then add to that transnational criminal organizations, cartels, who are in it for the money. Really, they're a business, but they'll move anything you want to move. You want to move human trafficking, they'll move human trafficking. You want to move drugs, they'll move drugs. You want to move weapons, they'll move weapons. You want to move terrorists, they'll move terrorists. So it's a very complex environment that, in my judgment, requires constant. It requires exquisite intelligence, very, very thoughtful relationships with allies and partners to share information and learn. And then in our case, it requires a significant amount of diplomacy to keep our allies and partners solid with us. That's what I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you, General. And I know that you like to take and you think it's very important to take a very holistic view of the role of the United States in the world, speaking of diplomacy. So would you mind saying a few words about how you see that? I mean, you know, what is the role of the United States, not just militarily, but in a more holistic way? What do you see as the role of the United States in the world?
Well, first of all, one of the things that when I was the chairman and we would have issues come into the National Security Council, the one thing that I always cautioned everyone about was, you know, don't always defer to the military instrument. We have a lot of elements of national power, a lot of instruments of national power: economic power, diplomatic power, information, reputational power, intelligence power, and of course military power. So, you know, my advice was always, if we have a problem, whatever kind of problem, it could be Ebola in West Africa, or it could be ISIS in Syria, we need to think about all the instruments of our power before we just start saying, you know, how many bombs can you drop, you know, in a 24-hour period. And so that's, you know, kind of job one, is for us to see ourselves as, you know, having options other than one thing or another. It's really a holistic thing. The second thing is, I've become really interested in, even in retirement, on, let's call it, power imbalances. I actually became most interested in it with because I'm part of the Olympic movement with USA Basketball. And you remember the Larry Nassar scandal in gymnastics? We're still dealing, all of us are still trying to figure out, how the heck could that happen? And how do we harden ourselves, protect our athletes to make sure it never happens again? And one of the things that comes out of that discussion and out of that study is that what leads to that are power imbalances, where a coach or a trainer has a power differential against an athlete or a young child in some cases. And so if you apply that idea of power imbalance on the global stage, we generally have a power imbalance. And for my way of, and by the way, that's a positive thing, but for my way of thinking about it, the more power you have, the more the responsibility to use it responsibly and in a way that can be imitated and that's seen as exemplary and is seen as productive and that cultivates hope. That's who I think we are. Mm-hmm. And so we have the capability. My judgment is we ought to be a little bit humble about it, really. Now, some people think humility is a sign of weakness. I mean, look, the Aristotelian everything in moderation kind of applies here. Too much courage is recklessness. Too much humility is frailty. But humility and ambition can coexist. And when you get them in the proper balance, it's powerful. And that's how I see personally, I think that's how we need to approach, in particular, international relations. But, I think it applies domestically as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, General, we know that political polarization in our country is a real challenge for us these days. And you've spoken out. I don't. Yeah, that's what I hear. That's what I hear. And I know that you have spoken out quite frequently and eloquently about the importance of keeping the military out of partisan politics and keeping partisan politics out of the military. Why is that so important to you? Could you just kind of talk a bit about that? Thanks.
The answer is trust. Remember I tell you that hope and trust have a close relationship? The relation, especially with we're an all-volunteer force. You know that since 1973, and we should remain so. I mean, I'm sure there's folks in the room, if we had more time, we could have a healthy discussion about, well, wouldn't it be great to have universal service and make everybody kind of pay their dues and understand what you understand from having served. I don't know that we could, I don't think we can't agree. We can't even have a continuing resolution. How in the heck are we going to have a universal service? I think that's a bridge too far, honestly. So I'm committed to the all-volunteer force. If you're going to have an all-volunteer force, first of all, you can ask two things of it that you can't ask a country. You can make standards higher. They volunteered. This is not like bringing in people and say, we're going to give you this standard. You volunteer to come in, you're going to meet this standard. And I'm talking about from the neck down and the neck up. You're going to meet physical standards, and we're going to develop you intellectually, emotionally, and so that you can think your way through problems, not just bludgeon your way through them. And then the second thing, we retain them better because we recruit. This is a reality today, by the way. We recruit. I'll use soldiers, but it's true of Air Force, Marines, and airmen. We recruit soldiers, but we retain families. So we bring them in, give them a sense of belonging, cultivate some hope, and then we keep them by embracing their families as part of the team. And, Deanie was my sidekick for 39 of those 41 years and worked tirelessly, really, especially when I was deployed, with the family members to make sure they felt a sense of belonging and were kept, as part of the team. And so but that takes trust. And now I'm going to finally land the plane on your question. The American people trust us. They don't look at us as Democrat or Republican, red state, blue state. They just don't look at us like that. They look at us as representing America until we prove otherwise. And so, if were we to embrace a particular political ideology or be seen to be embracing it, what's the other side going to do? And by the way, when the power shifts, what are they going to think? You cannot maintain the trust of the American people with a politicized military. Cannot do it. And by the way, that carries over not only on active duty, it carries over into retirement, in particular, and maybe even exclusively, for generals and admirals. If you want to know how we got in part where we are today with the mistrust of generals and admirals, it's because we had some outspoken generals and admirals in previous election cycles. And, politicians listen. And if they don't think they can trust you, they won't trust you. And then you got to claw your way back. So the answer to your question is the American people don't want their military politicized. I'm convinced of that. And as long as we keep that the case, even though, by the way, as God is my witness, as the saying goes, both parties do it. Have you ever noticed that in election cycles, they'll have, it's almost like dueling banjos in Deliverance. They'll go out and they'll get these lists of signatures. Who's supporting Hillary Clinton? Who's supporting Donald Trump? And then they compare lists. And who's got more people on their list? These are retirees, by the way, not active. Who's got more? I got more people than you. I got more important. It's just silly, really. And it does a disservice to the military. It does a disservice to the American people. So, not that I have strong feelings about it.
No, I appreciate that very much, and it resonates with me, that's for sure. And I think many of us here in the audience, it resonates with us here at Notre Dame. Incredibly important. You've spoken about the importance of creating high information systems as a leader, in contrast to low information systems. Do you mind saying a few words about that? What does that mean? And then related to that, it'd be great if you would share an example where you either had to give or receive counsel that was difficult.
Yeah. Well, high information system is just that. It's a system built to absorb, to accumulate a lot of information and a lot of viewpoints. In former times, I might have called it inclusion, but I could have my picture could get taken off the wall of the Pentagon if I say that. So I'm being a little careful about choice of words now. But my wife's giving me the kill sign here. But honestly, it is about high information systems vice low information systems. Why do I prefer a high information system? I prefer it because it produces better learning. It actually creates friction. Do you realize that our government is built on a principle of creating friction on purpose? 3 branches of government are created the government works best with friction. By the way, I'm not a physicist. Any physicists in the room? Why do tires move your car? Good answer. Because the rubber creates friction with the road. That's the way democracy works, too. It really does. It creates friction. The key is for leaders to keep it creative. And, that's where I think we sometimes, can wax back and forth. So a high information system produces more information. By the way, it also provides ownership. So if you have a voice, you're going to own the problem better than if you're just told what to do. And then third, it creates friction, which I find to be important in the wheels of decision making. Low information system, just the opposite. It's fewer points of view, less ownership, no friction, and you get what you get. So, example of, but I will say that the president I worked for, he embraced friction. He used to tell us, this meeting is too cordial. And I'd say, well, okay. I don't like that suit. I'm just kidding. He would say that, though. He'd say, this meeting's too cordial. This is a big issue. We don't have to be, be excessively kind to each other here. We got to get this job done. The second thing he would say is, you need to surprise me. Because he read all the stuff I read. And in fact, he probably read more than I read. And so he said, look, when you come in this room, I don't care what the issue is, you need to be ready to give me advice or and he said, even if you don't know what, I was in a meeting about the Keystone Pipeline. I said, what the heck? What am I in a meeting about the Keystone Pipeline about? So he's going around a room and he got to me, and by this time I knew him pretty well. So I said, well, Mr. President, unless you want to blow it up, I got nothing for you. He laughed, and then he leaned back in his chair, and I got filleted. But not filleted nastily. He said, you know what? He said, this gives me a chance to make a point. And I thought, great. He said, everybody in this room is here for your expertise. You're also here for your mind. I need you all thinking. He said, you might be sitting there, Marty, and maybe you heard something that doesn't make sense to you, or there's a question left unanswered that, he said, I got to know. He said, because I count on these, 15 people around this table to actually help me think. And he said, you didn't do it today. I said, got it. And by the way, that's the last time I ever came to a meeting unprepared, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, that's
So,
great story.
I mean, look, by the way, the giving of tough answers to tough questions, I mean, that's the job, really.
Yeah.
By the time you get to be the president and his advisor, the easy issues are long gone.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're in there just, hashing it out. And the more people that can, have an ingredient, the better off the stew generally becomes.
Yeah. My last question for the moment, then I'm going to turn to some questions that we've received from the audience. But you suggested that one of the responsibilities of a leader is to provide those under his or her care memories.
Yeah.
Memories. Do you have memories you'd like to leave us with today?
I do. There's a, when you lose a soldier in combat, it's just it's so difficult on the family, obviously, but it's also difficult on the command structure, because you feel like, even though it's impossible, you feel like you've let them down somehow. It's impossible to prevent casualties. I mean, heck, even in peacetime, we have accidents that take soldiers' lives. But in combat, you really want to, you really feel like you need to be able to, especially as a senior leader, to encourage and to console. So that's the task. Encourage them to go back out, console. And when we would lose soldiers, we'd have memorial services. And it would be like this, except most people would be standing. But generally, they'd have chairs for the, if there was one soldier out of 12 in a squad killed, they'd have 11 soldiers sitting there. And, at the end of the ceremony, they would want, the senior person, who was generally me, to go down the line. And then everybody else would go down and do the same. They would encourage and console. And by the way, soldiers in combat, when they lose a friend, they have both fear, because they got to go back out, and guilt. The amount of guilt that a squad mate has when one of their own is killed is unimaginable. Surprised me, actually. I mean, I adjusted to it, but it surprised me. So I really wanted to be that person with the right words. Well, the first couple of times I did it, I swung and missed, frankly. And then I'm glad I'm having this conversation with you at a Catholic university, because I don't know where this came from, but I woke up one morning with a phrase in my head. I was praying. What do I do? God, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make this work for them. And I woke up with this phrase, make it matter. And I thought, wow, maybe that's it. So next memorial service, I go down the line and I look the soldiers in the eye and I said, make it matter. You can't bring them back. You can't change it. But make the sacrifice matter in the way you live your life. Not just in combat, but in the way you live your life. And that's not a phrase, by the way, that's unique or shouldn't be unique to the military. I told students today in Father John's class, I said, you've all got somebody who got you here. And you owe them, a sense of appreciation, and you need to make what you do in your life matter for the sacrifices they made. I think isn't that true of all of us? Does anybody really think they got anywhere by themselves?
Yeah.
So make it matter. And I'm standing up only because I'm going to give you something, Father. So what I did was I had a coin made. Generals and admirals give out coins because we don't give out, monetary stipends or bonuses. And this is the flag of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs with the 4 stars on it. And on the back, I had engraved, make it matter. And
That's
so
beautiful.
you're making it matter for
Oh,
Notre Dame.
thank you. Thank you, General. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What a great gift.
Yeah.
What a great gift.
Thank you.
Yeah. We will do everything we can to make it matter here at Notre Dame.
Well,
and,
just keep cultivating hope. You're on
yeah.
you're on the right track.
Well, thank you. Thank you, General. So we have a few questions that have been submitted, and the first one is from one of our students. As
Are
a
they in the room?
student in the room?
Can you point them out to me? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, okay. We probably could, but
In case I don't like it.
yeah. As a second lieutenant, did you feel like you had an impact on the greater scale of global peace and hope? How can we, as field leaders, best serve the goal of peace?
Well, you know, I just as they say that, that's a great question, by the way. I don't know that I was as smart as honestly, I am not as smart as the young men and women you're producing here at Notre Dame. I think honestly, I look back at the Vietnam years and I feel like I was oblivious to the whole thing. You know, I mean, I caught up eventually, but I just don't think I was as self-aware as students are today. They're incredible. Which means they also put a bigger burden on themselves than I did. You know, my burden was, is Deanie going to say yes if I ask her to go watch Mary Poppins? Well, the answer to that is yes, because she loves Mary Poppins. But so first thing I would say is I admire the self-awareness, actually the awareness in general. Secondly, I would say that just as character is the accumulation of habits over life. You know, you can't develop character today. You can start developing it today. You know, the virtues that produce a life of character. That's your first job, whoever asked the question. At your stage in life, develop the skills that you need if you're going to go be a doctor or you're going to go be a financial advisor. But work just as hard on your character. A lot of times we working on skills is the easy part. Working on character is the hard part. You know, what do you do? Do you do the right thing when nobody's looking? You know what I mean? Are you truthful? Are you temperate? That's one of the Christian virtues. Are you temperate in your lifestyle? And by the way, I can guarantee you I wasn't temperate all the time. Mm-hmm. But I was aware when I wasn't that I wasn't, because I was worried about it.
And the nun helped.
And of course confession, that specter of confession every Friday was helping too. I didn't want to go admit that I was intemperate. Yeah, of course it helped. But the point is, just as character is the accumulation of habits over a lifetime to define your character, you're asking about global peace. Let me pull it in a little closer and say the people you lead, you will have the privilege of leading, will expect you to have both competence and character. And to the degree that you have it, they'll have it. And to the degree that they have it, somebody else is going to have it. And the next thing you know, we actually care about character as much as we care about competence. That's where we need to be. And so I love the question. Start, you know what Arthur Ashe said? This is one of my favorite quotes. Arthur Ashe, you remember Arthur Ashe, tennis player? Also philanthropist, humanitarian. He said this: start where you are with what you have. And what's the third one? Start where you are with what you have and not make it matter. What's it?
Do what you can.
And do what you can. Start where you are. You can't start anyplace else. With what you have. Well, she's heard this like 25 times. With what you have. Yeah. It's really true, isn't it? It's just true.
That's great.
And so great question.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another question. What's one habit you'd ask civilian leaders to change, and one you'd ask uniformed leaders to change to rebuild nonpartisanship and more trust?
Yeah. I actually did ask often in my time, I would always, if the president said, come over, we want to, I'm going to sign the National Defense Authorization Act, and I want you all standing around me. And I would say, Mr. President, I'd really rather not do that. I mean, I'd rather not be, a backdrop for what is fundamentally a political act. Now, by the way, he was pretty good about that. The second thing, as I mentioned to you, I would just encourage our politicians. You all do what you do with each other, but for the sake of the bond of trust between the military and the American people, don't drag us into it. And I would, and like the letter thing, I'd say, don't go out soliciting signatures on a letter that nobody cares about, except that it looks bad for our profession. So that's the kind of thing I would ask them, and then of ourselves. And you may find this interesting. We have a tendency to be a little arrogant, or something just short of arrogant, perhaps, about the fact that we know more about what the country needs militarily than they do, they being elected officials. And I used to tell, I would get a general or an admiral, complaining to me about the fact that they weren't treated all that well in a congressional hearing, or, they felt like that their advice was dismissed categorically by a particular congressman or senator. And I'd say, look, that you own, meaning our military guys, own 60% of the relationship. If there's going to be a relationship between the military and our elected officials, you own 60% of it. You just do. And don't expect them to have the same sensitivity to this that we do, because we are the ones that in my judgment, remember the power imbalance thing? I felt like we wear, we walk into their offices. We got stars every place. I was telling Father John, 12 rows of ribbons, half of which are like perfect attendance, but they look good. And we tend to kind of overwhelm. And I said, look, just have a little humility, listen, and remember this: we know more about the military than they do. They know more about the American people than we do. That's true. They know more about their constituents, more about their local neighborhoods and congressional districts than we do. So I said, maybe we ought to learn from each other. So that's it. But that's what I would change. I tried to tone down that sense of, I'm smarter than you are about national security.
Great. Thank you. Here's another question. I am a second grade teacher, and we talk early about being a good leader. It's good to talk about being a good leader early on in one's life. What are the top 3 qualities of a good leader?
I think that a good leader starts by being a good follower. We talked about that in Father John's course today with the seniors. And I mean, for one thing, in the course of your life, I mean, I'm sure in this room there are CEOs and there are presidents and, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The fact is, though, in my 41-year military career, I was, I never was completely in charge of myself or anything, really. I always had somebody, who was either higher in rank or when I finally got to Washington, in a position of authority. And so I think the first step in being a good leader is to think about what it means to be a good follower. And what that's really about is trying to put yourself in the leader's place. You have to think about, I know what I think is right, and I know what's going on in my life. Maybe I should learn a little bit about what they think and what's going on in their life before we reach an impasse. And that happened to me with the president. I was telling Father John earlier, I had what I thought was a burning issue, and I called over to the White House Chief of Staff. I said, I got to get in and see the president. I got to see him. And he said, okay. So what do you need? And I said, we had something going on in Afghanistan. It wasn't a crisis. I was about to make it one, but it wasn't a crisis. And he said, well, look, the president, this is when, if you remember, when Obamacare first came online, the network crashed. Remember that? And so he was in the middle of, his network crash, the Obamacare network crash. And I'm there, I got to see the president. He said, okay, look, if you want to see him, I'll get you in. But I don't know what question you're going to ask, but the answer is going to be no. Because he is in no mood for dialogue right now. He's in the middle of this other thing, which taught me a real lesson, which really is, learn more about help the person leading you lead. Help them. You can't be arrogant and say, hey, by the way, this is the way we ought to do this. Just, you stop leading the way you're leading and do it the way I think. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just helping them understand, which I'll tell you, the best I ever had of that was Secretary Gates. He really welcomed kind of bottom-up advice. And then besides followership, I'm a big believer in humility, honestly, as a leader. Because listen, if you're humble, you're approachable, right? If you're not humble, if you're arrogant, are you approachable? No. People don't wander up to some arrogant person and say, hey, I got a problem. I wonder if you could help me with it. It just doesn't happen because they're afraid of getting blown away. So I think humility is really that. And the last one is moral courage, not physical courage, moral courage. Some of that is, I was chairman, Colin Powell came in to see me early on and said, here's my advice. Every morning when you wake up, don't be afraid to get fired today. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, if you worry too much about your job, you're not going to be given the kind of advice you need to give. And he said, you don't have to go around advertising it. You don't have to walk in and say, I'm okay if you fire me. And by the way, here's what I recommend. Colin Powell, he was a good man.
Thank you, General. Last question here. How do you think or process key decisions with imperfect information? A high information environment sounds important. Are there other key elements?
Yeah. Remember I said that your character is a accumulation of a lifetime of habits, right? So I had an aide who gave me a no kidding compass. He went to an antique store and he found a compass and he had it engraved with along 8 points of the compass with virtues: courage, loyalty, discipline, patience, whatever it was, teamwork, whatever it was. And he gave it to me as he was leaving working for me, and he said, this is what I've learned from you is, first of all, that you have to have a moral compass. You have to have, by the way, a lot of us are, I think a lot of us probably grew up in a home with values and religion. And so some of that you carry with you. Not everybody in this country grows up that way. So some people have a longer road to walk to build a moral compass. But to answer your question, you never have enough information to make a perfect decision, ever, in any line of work. I don't think. I mean, I'd like to think the guy who worked on my knee and replaced it had a perfect knowledge. But I don't know. He might have been winging it too, for all I know. But in reality, the hard issues, you're gonna make a decision based on as much information as you can get, and then you know what you make your decision on? Your instincts. I had a great meeting today with Marcus Freeman. He said, do you have any advice? I said, yeah, trust your instincts, which I think he does already, but it's not a bad thing to confirm that, because sometimes you think, oh, maybe I don't have his. He's got great instincts. I think most of you do too. So you get to a point, you got to make a decision. You got all the information you could possibly have, and then what do? You listen to that voice inside your head. If it goes well, you own it. If it goes badly, you own it, and that's the way life is.
Wow. Well, thank you. This, among other things, this has been a masterclass in leadership. And General, we can't thank you enough. Before we go our separate ways, I have a little something for you.
Oh, my goodness.
Speaking of Marcus Freeman, we have a football here autographed by our football coach. And this is for Deanie and for you, General. And it's an honor to present you with this football. And if you'd like to play catch after this, we could go outside and
Actually,
play
I'll try
catch.
not to fumble it.
Okay. And maybe we can just pose with a
That's great.
little photo here. Excellent. And General, thank you for being such a great friend of Notre Dame. And most of all, thank you for your thoughtful and selfless service of our country, and thank you for your servant leadership. I know I certainly find it inspiring, and I know that we all find your example so incredibly inspiring. So please join me in thanking General Martin Dempsey.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.